The air was thick with humiliation. "Don't you ever talk back to me, Nancy." Ethan Caldwell's voice was low and sharp, each syllable laced with condescension. His icy blue eyes held no warmth as he towered over her. "You are nothing here. Nothing. Clean this room now, or don't bother coming back tomorrow." Naomi Carter, known to everyone here as Nancy the janitor, tightened her grip on the mop handle. Her voice was measured, controlled. "Sir, the floors are already spotless. I've cleaned them repeatedly." But Ethan didn't care. Without another word, he lifted a cup of water and deliberately poured it over her head. The ice-cold liquid ran through her hair, down her face, and soaked into her uniform, pooling at her feet on the freshly mopped floor. A sharp gasp escaped her lips, not from the temperature, but from the sheer cruelty of the act. "Now you have something real to clean up," Ethan sneered before turning away, completely indifferent to the humiliation he had just inflicted. Little did he know, he hadn't just insulted a janitor. He had humiliated the one person who could destroy his entire career. Before we dive deeper into this story, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button. If you believe no one should be treated unfairly, no matter their position, drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. The polished marble floors of Carter Dynamics' executive level gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Naomi, hidden beneath her disguise as Nancy, moved silently through the hall, pushing her mop in smooth, practiced strokes. A small, generic name tag pinned to her chest read Nancy, concealing the truth that she was Naomi Carter, heir to the multi-billion-dollar empire. The very hands that had signed million-dollar contracts were now raw and red from harsh industrial cleaning chemicals. Footsteps. The distinct click of expensive leather shoes against tile. Naomi barely had time to brace herself before Ethan Caldwell, the operations manager, appeared beside her. He had never looked her in the eye during high-level executive meetings, yet here he was, looming over her with a stack of reports in one hand and an air of casual arrogance. A gust of frustration flickered in Naomi's sharp brown eyes, but she remained silent. Her jaw clenched as she bent down to retrieve a few damp papers that had slipped from Ethan's grip. Every fiber of her being ached to stand up, rip off her disguise, and fire this man on the spot. But this wasn't the time. This wasn't why she was here. Naomi Carter was no ordinary janitor. She was a 28-year-old Harvard Business School graduate, a rising star in the industry, and a name that had already been featured in Forbes 30 Under 30 for her groundbreaking work in sustainable technology. And Carter Dynamics wasn't just any corporation. It was a $5 billion tech empire, built from the ground up by her father, Samuel Carter. 35 years ago, Samuel had nothing but a dream, and $2,000 borrowed from his grandmother. From his tiny garage, he built a financial technology giant, one of the few black-owned companies in Skyline City that had shattered glass ceilings in an industry dominated by privilege. Now at 60, Samuel Carter was a legend. His silver-streaked hair and deep laugh lines told the story of a man who had fought impossible odds and won. But lately, his once commanding presence had been overshadowed by fatigue. A heart attack 6 months ago had been the wake-up call no one was ready for. The doctors were clear. Reduce your stress immediately, or you won't survive another year. The 80-hour workweeks that had defined Samuel's career were no longer an option. Succession planning, once a distant conversation for someday, had suddenly become urgent. And Naomi was the only logical choice. She had been groomed for leadership since graduation, trained to take over the empire her father built. But despite her qualifications, Samuel hesitated. His concerns kept him awake at night. It was during a quiet dinner at their modernist home, overlooking the dazzling lights of Skyline City, that Samuel finally voiced the thoughts that had been troubling him. "Naomi, you know, I couldn't be prouder of everything you've accomplished." His voice was deep, steady. The same voice that had inspired thousands of employees. "Your business acumen is extraordinary. Your technical knowledge is impressive." Then he paused. His sharp brown eyes, so much like hers, softened with concern. "But I'm worried about what you don't know." Naomi set her fork down. A single eyebrow arched in curiosity. "What don't I know, Dad?" Samuel sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. The weight of his legacy was heavy. "You've never seen this company from the ground up. You don't know what it's like to be invisible." You've never experienced how management treats the people who actually keep this company running, the ones without fancy titles or corner offices. Naomi opened her mouth to protest, but Samuel raised a hand to stop her. When I started this company, I was the janitor, the accountant, the salesman, and the engineer. I knew every aspect of my business because I had done every job. That perspective is priceless. His voice turned somber. I've been hearing whispers that the company culture isn't what we intended it to be, that people are being treated differently when no one is watching. But when you're the CEO's daughter, Naomi, everyone puts on a show for you. You can't lead what you don't truly understand. The challenge hung in the air between them. Naomi Carter had never backed down from a challenge. She leaned forward, her eyes sharp with determination. What are you suggesting, Dad? And that's when the plan was born. For 2 weeks, Naomi Carter would go undercover as Nancy, a low-wage night shift janitor at Carter Dynamics. No special treatment, no shortcuts, no privilege. She would experience her father's empire from the bottom of the corporate ladder. Her designer wardrobe was replaced with faded, second-hand clothes. Her sleek, straightened hair was left in its natural curls, tucked beneath a simple headscarf. Her perfectly manicured nails were stripped bare, her signature makeup abandoned. Her luxury glasses were swapped for plain, unremarkable frames. Her diamond studs replaced with cheap metal hoops. By the time the transformation was complete, Naomi Carter had disappeared. In her place stood Nancy, a faceless worker no one would ever notice. Her father arranged for her placement through a third-party cleaning service, ensuring not even HR would know who she really was. For 2 weeks, she would find out if Carter Dynamics was still the company her father had built, or if it had become something far worse. What she didn't know was how those 2 weeks would change everything. Naomi opened her mouth to protest, but Samuel Carter raised a hand, silencing her. When I built this company, I was the janitor, the accountant, the salesman, and the engineer, he said, his voice calm but firm. I knew every aspect of this business because I had done every job myself. That perspective is invaluable. His sharp eyes, so much like hers, held a weight of genuine concern. The reports that cross your desk don't tell you what really happens beyond the executive floor. His voice dropped lower. I've been hearing things, Naomi. Things about how different the company culture has become from what we intended. Naomi frowned. People put on a show for the boss and his family. You can't lead what you don't truly understand. The challenge hung in the air between them. And Naomi Carter never backed down from a challenge. She leaned forward, her mind already working through possibilities. What are you suggesting, Dad? That night, over coffee and quiet determination, they devised a radical plan. For 2 weeks, Naomi would go undercover as Nancy, a night shift cleaner at Carter Dynamics. No special treatment, no shortcuts, no privilege. She would see firsthand how employees without titles and offices were treated. The transformation was drastic. Her designer wardrobe was replaced with worn, second-hand clothes. Her sleek, straightened hair was left in its natural curls and covered with a simple headscarf. Her manicured nails were stripped bare. Her signature makeup look was abandoned. Her luxury glasses were swapped for plain, generic frames. Her diamond studs replaced with cheap, metal hoops. By the time she looked in the mirror, Naomi Carter had disappeared. In her place stood Nancy, a nameless, faceless worker who would go unnoticed in the halls of her father's empire. Samuel arranged for her placement through MetroClean, a third-party cleaning service. To ensure her cover was airtight, he personally handled the background check and employment paperwork, making sure no one in HR at Carter Dynamics would recognize her name. As far as the company was concerned, Nancy was just another new hire. Her mission was simple: 2 weeks to uncover the true culture of Carter Dynamics. 2 weeks to determine if the company still reflected the values her father built it on. But what she didn't know was how those 2 weeks would change her forever. The next evening, Nancy Carter stood in the dimly lit employee locker room, adjusting the stiff, ill-fitting gray uniform assigned to her. Her hands, now bare of jewelry and polish, fidgeted with the unfamiliar employee badge clipped to her chest. For the first time in her life, she felt nervous. At exactly 10 p.m., her first shift began. By then, most executives had already left for the night, their offices dark and empty. The orientation was brief and impersonal, a hurried walkthrough of cleaning protocols, safety rules, and a stern warning that theft of any kind would result in immediate termination and possible criminal charges. The supervisor barely looked at her as he tossed a ring of keys and a printed checklist into her hands. Then, without another word, he walked away. Throughout her life, Naomi Carter had commanded attention. As Samuel Carter's daughter, as a Harvard graduate, as an executive vice president, people noticed her when she entered a room. But as Nancy the cleaner, she was invisible. Executives stepped around her without a word, sometimes even bumping into her cart without so much as an apology. In offices where people were still working, they continued their conversations freely, discussing confidential business deals without a second thought about the janitor emptying their trash. By the end of her first shift, Naomi's body ached in ways it never had before. Her soft hands had already begun to develop calluses. Her back throbbed from bending, lifting, and scrubbing. She had learned to move efficiently, conserving energy in ways that only someone used to physical labor would understand. But it wasn't just the physical exhaustion that shook her. It was the patterns she started noticing, the way different employees treated the cleaning staff. Some people were polite. They said thank you or acknowledged her presence with a nod. But most people treated janitors like they didn't exist. Even after years as an executive, Naomi had never truly seen her company from this angle. Now, standing at the bottom, she could finally see the cracks in the foundation. Carter Dynamics, the company her father built, looked very different from this side. By her fourth night, Naomi, still disguised as Nancy, had begun to adjust to the physical demands of her new role. The muscle aches that had once left her stiff and sore had dulled into a constant throb, manageable but ever-present. Her hands, once soft, now bore the rough calluses of a laborer. She had learned to distribute her weight properly while mopping, keeping the strain off her back. But no amount of physical endurance could prepare her for what was coming next. Because Ethan Caldwell, the operations manager of Carter Dynamics, was about to turn her life into a nightmare. At 45 years old, Ethan Caldwell had climbed the corporate ladder through sheer ruthlessness. To the executive team, he was a model employee, sharp, disciplined, results-driven. His perfectly pressed shirts, neatly combed blonde hair, and ever-present leather portfolio projected an aura of control. But to the cleaning staff, Ethan was a tyrant. His mood swings were unpredictable, his standards impossible to meet, and his demeanor outright cruel. And Naomi, being the newest cleaner, had caught his attention in the worst way. "This is unacceptable." Ethan's voice cut through the silence as he held up a white glove, inspecting it with exaggerated scrutiny. The other cleaners froze. Naomi, who had been wiping down a desk, braced herself. "Do you people even know what clean means?" he snapped, lifting his gloved hand. A barely visible speck of dust clung to the tip of his finger. It wasn't on a desk or a chair or a computer screen. It was from above a ceiling vent, an area not even on the nightly cleaning schedule. "Carter Dynamics represents excellence in everything," Ethan continued, his voice dangerously low. "And yet, I find this..." He flicked the glove toward them in disgust. He turned to the entire cleaning crew, his gaze sweeping over them like they were insects beneath his shoes. "I want the entire third-floor east wing re-cleaned, every inch, and if it's not perfect, you're all staying late." A murmur rippled through the crew. It was already past their shift. Elena, a veteran cleaner, gathered the courage to speak up. "Sir, the vents are part of the quarterly deep cleaning schedule. It's not meant to be done nightly." Ethan cut her off with a sharp glare. "If I wanted excuses, I'd ask for them." His voice dripped with condescension. "What I want is competence, which seems to be in very short supply around here." Naomi bit her tongue. Her father had built this company on integrity. And here was one of his managers abusing his power just because he could. But she couldn't blow her cover, not yet. So, like the others, she picked up her mop and got back to work. Ethan's cruelty wasn't limited to the cleaning crew as a whole. He seemed to take a particular pleasure in tormenting Naomi. Maybe it was because she was new and hadn't yet learned to disappear when he entered the room. Or maybe, just maybe, something about her posture, the confidence she couldn't fully hide, made him want to break her. Whatever the reason, Ethan made her his personal project. No matter how meticulously she cleaned, he found a problem. The windows had streaks, but only if viewed from a specific angle with a flashlight. The carpets had microscopic lint, requiring her to vacuum 3 times. The stainless steel surfaces gleamed until Ethan pressed his own fingers onto them and accused her of missing spots. Her first solo shift cleaning the executive restrooms was the worst. She was in the middle of scrubbing a sink when Ethan walked in unannounced. Without waiting for her to finish, he began his inspection. He criticized her technique. He insulted her choice of cleaning products. He even rearranged her supply cart, calling her incompetent for the way it was organized. Then, in front of several passing employees, he raised his voice. "Are you deliberately trying to be this incompetent, or does it just come naturally to you?" The words hit her like a slap. Naomi forced herself to remain still. She had never been spoken to like this before. As executive VP, she could have ended Ethan's career with one email. But as Nancy the cleaner, she had no power. All she could do was apologize and promise to do better. The other cleaners had noticed Ethan's growing obsession with humiliating the new girl. One of them, Raymond, an older janitor with graying hair and tired eyes, pulled Naomi aside after one particularly brutal night. "You need to stay out of his way." His voice was low and cautious, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was listening. Naomi's hands were still shaking from the verbal assault she had just endured. "Ethan gets off on making people miserable," Raymond muttered, "especially people who can't fight back. You think this is bad? It'll only get worse if you don't keep your head down." Naomi swallowed her pride. For the first time in her life, she was being told to accept unfair treatment just to survive. But she wasn't here just to survive. She was here to witness, to understand, to document, and to bring justice. Thursday night, 11:30 p.m. Naomi was cleaning the hallway outside the main conference room on the executive floor. Her cart was neatly positioned against the wall, allowing for easy passage. The office was nearly empty, most employees having gone home for the night. She had just finished refilling her mop bucket when she heard the familiar sound of polished leather shoes. Ethan Caldwell. Her stomach tightened. As he approached, she stepped to the side, trying to avoid conflict. But Ethan had other plans. With a calculated motion, he swung his arm out, just enough to hit the edge of her cleaning cart. It toppled over, sending supplies, paper towels, and dirty water crashing to the floor. Naomi froze. Ethan paused, looking down at the mess he had deliberately created. Then, with a smirk, he stepped right through the spilled water, leaving muddy footprints across the floor she had just spent an hour perfecting. And he never looked back. Never acknowledged what he had done, never offered to help. Naomi's hands curled into fists. For the first time since she started this mission, she felt rage stronger than humiliation. Because this wasn't just disrespect. This was calculated cruelty, and it was only the beginning. The corridor was eerily silent, the dim overhead lights casting long shadows across the marble floors. Naomi had just finished refilling her mop bucket when the sharp, rhythmic sound of leather shoes against stone reached her ears. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Ethan Caldwell. Her grip on the mop instinctively tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. As he approached, he stopped directly beside her cleaning cart, surveying the area with a slow, exaggerated scrutiny. "Still here, Nancy?" he mused, his voice laced with amusement. Naomi didn't respond. She knew better than to engage. Ethan tilted his head, eyes flicking between her and the pristine floor. Then, in a single, casual motion, he extended his arm, just enough to collide with the edge of her cart. The crash echoed down the empty hallway. The bucket tipped over, sending soapy water splashing across the floor. Cleaning supplies scattered, rolling across the tiles. Naomi froze. Ethan paused just long enough to admire his handiwork before stepping forward, deliberately walking through the mess, his expensive shoes leaving a trail of footprints across the freshly cleaned surface. He never looked back, never offered an apology, never acknowledged what he had done. To him, it wasn't even worth mentioning. But to Naomi, it was the moment something inside her shifted. This wasn't just disrespect anymore. This wasn't just about her cover or the company's culture. This was calculated cruelty, and she wasn't going to let it go unnoticed. The following nights, Ethan's harassment escalated, but what he didn't know was that Naomi had started documenting everything. Timestamps, witness accounts, exact words spoken. She tracked who enabled him and who remained silent. Every insult, every fabricated complaint, every impossible demand, she recorded it all. And as her evidence grew, so did her resolve. 2 nights later, she was mopping near the executive conference room when Ethan returned. This time, he didn't just walk through her work. He stood directly in her path, watching. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he murmured, stepping closer. Naomi stayed silent, gripping the mop handle tightly. She knew anything she said would only escalate the situation. So she focused on her task, pretending to ignore him. That only infuriated him more. "I'm speaking to you, Nancy." His voice turned sharp. She forced herself to look up. "Yes, sir," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. Ethan's lips curled into a smirk. "Didn't they teach you basic respect in whatever gutter they pulled you from?" A sharp sting of anger flared inside her, but she buried it deep. "Sorry, sir?" The words tasted like acid on her tongue. Ethan glanced down at the floor. It was flawless, polished to perfection. But that didn't matter. With slow deliberation, he lifted his shoe and pressed it firmly onto the damp tiles. A dark footprint appeared in the middle of the immaculate floor. "This floor is still filthy," he announced loudly, as if speaking to an audience, though they were alone. Naomi's stomach twisted. "Sir, I just cleaned it." Ethan's expression darkened. "Are you contradicting me?" he interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. He took another step, then another, tracking dirt and grime over her hard work. "Do you think you know more about cleaning standards at Carter Dynamics than I do?" Naomi's grip on the mop tightened so hard her knuckles turned white. Ethan tilted his head, studying her reaction. Then, with chilling calm, he reached for the cup of water on a nearby table. And before Naomi could react, he dumped it straight over her head. The shock of the cold water stole Naomi's breath. It soaked through her uniform, dripping from her hair, running down her face. She shivered as it puddled at her feet, mixing with the soapy water on the floor. Ethan smiled. "Now," he said, dropping the empty cup beside her, "you have something real to clean up." Then he turned and walked away. Naomi stood frozen. Water dripped from her uniform, soaking into her shoes, but the humiliation burned hotter than the cold liquid. At that moment, she wasn't Naomi Carter, Harvard graduate. She wasn't even Nancy the cleaner. She was just a human being, one who had been publicly degraded by someone who believed they would face no consequences. Naomi clenched her jaw, forcing down the rage, the frustration, the disbelief. Slowly, she knelt down and began mopping up the water. But inside she made a silent vow. Ethan Caldwell would face the consequences of his actions, not just for what he had done to her, but for every worker he had ever mistreated. For every invisible employee whose dignity had been trampled. For the very people her father had once been before he built his empire. Naomi's clothes clung to her, the fabric heavy with water as it dripped onto the marble floor. She was shivering, but not from the cold. The humiliation burned hotter than any anger she had ever known. At that moment, she wasn't Naomi Carter, Harvard graduate and executive VP. She wasn't even Nancy the cleaner. She was just a human being, stripped of dignity, treated like nothing by a man who knew there would be no consequences. Water trickled down her face, mixing with the tears she refused to let fall. With slow, deliberate movements, she knelt and began mopping up the mess. Her hands shook, but her resolve was stronger than ever. Ethan Caldwell thought he had won. He thought he had broken her. But he had only made her more determined. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every invisible worker in this company. This was about justice. And Ethan was only the beginning. If Ethan Caldwell ruled through intimidation, then Darren Vaughn operated through manipulation. At 42, Darren was the marketing director of Carter Dynamics and had built a reputation as a charismatic, visionary leader. His artfully styled hair, designer glasses, and tailored suits gave him an air of effortless success, creative without seeming too corporate. To outsiders, he was charming, approachable, even inspiring. But to those beneath him, he was a nightmare. And Naomi was about to find out firsthand. Her first encounter with Darren happened during her second week undercover when his office came up on her cleaning rotation. According to the schedule, the task should have taken no more than 20 minutes. Instead, it consumed over 3 hours, leaving her rushing to finish her other assigned areas before the shift ended. It started when she entered his office at 10:05 p.m. Darren was still working, eyes fixed on his computer screen. Unlike most executives who either ignored her completely or barely acknowledged her presence, Darren immediately engaged. "Oh, good, you're here," he said, not even glancing away from his monitor. "This office is an absolute disaster. We had a brainstorming session today, and it needs a deep clean." Naomi glanced around. A few coffee cups sat on the side table. A couple of papers were stacked neatly on his desk. The carpet looked perfectly fine. It was far from a disaster. Still, she nodded and began her routine. She started with the trash bins, then moved to dust the bookshelves. As she worked, she felt his eyes on her. Not casual glances, but scrutiny. And then, just as she moved to clean the glass coffee table, Darren cleared his throat dramatically. "That's not how you clean glass properly," he announced, finally rising from his desk. Naomi paused, cloth still in hand. "You're leaving streaks everywhere," he continued, stepping closer. "You need to use circular motions, not straight lines." Naomi tightened her grip on the cloth. She had been trained in proper cleaning techniques, but this wasn't about cleaning, this was about control. Still, she simply nodded. "Yes, sir, I'll fix it." She wiped the glass again, making sure it was flawless. But when she stepped back, Darren performed a theatrical inspection, running his fingers along the surface and holding them up to the light as if checking for invisible dust. "This simply won't do," he declared, shaking his head. Naomi frowned slightly. The glass was pristine. The windows still have smudges, the carpet has lint, and did you even dust the picture frames? Her jaw clenched, but she kept her tone neutral. "I'll take care of it, sir." She cleaned everything again, even more meticulously than before. By the time she finished, Darren was waiting, and, as expected, he found something new to criticize. "The baseboards are still dusty," he sighed. Naomi had just cleaned them. "And my desk wasn't properly organized." She stiffened. She had been explicitly instructed never to touch executives' papers. "And what's that smell?" he added, sniffing dramatically. Naomi blinked. "Did you use the wrong cleaning solution? This room should smell fresh, not like chemicals." She had used the exact products required by company guidelines. But Darren wasn't looking for a real problem. He was looking for a reason to exert control. So with a quiet, "Yes, sir," she cleaned everything again. After the third cleaning, Darren finally leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk flickering across his face. "That'll do for now," he said dismissively, returning to his computer. Naomi glanced at the clock. She had lost over 3 hours to his game. She would have to rush through the rest of her shift, knowing she would likely be reprimanded for not finishing her other assigned areas. As she gathered her supplies, she saw Darren watching her from the corner of his eye. He was enjoying this. The power. The knowledge that she couldn't object or refuse. And Naomi knew then. Darren Vaughn was just as bad as Ethan Caldwell. He just preferred to play with his food before devouring it. Over the next few days, Naomi started noticing something disturbing. Darren did this often. He demanded multiple cleanings of his already spotless office. He manufactured flaws just to keep the cleaning staff working longer. He would leave coffee cups teetering on the edge of trash bins, ensuring they spilled when emptied, just so he could complain. He would scatter paper clips on freshly vacuumed carpets and blame the janitors for a poor job. And no one stopped him, no one questioned it, because no one cared. Darren had built his entire career on perception, a friendly, approachable leader in public, but a monster in private. And Naomi knew his type. She had encountered men like him in boardrooms, investment meetings, and high-stakes negotiations. He was a predator. The only difference? This time, he didn't know who he was playing with. By the end of her second week, Naomi's notebook of evidence was growing. She had recorded Ethan's verbal abuse and public humiliation, Darren's manipulative power games and mistreatment of staff, the silence of executives who saw but did nothing. And she was just getting started, because the more she uncovered, the closer she got to the real truth. The Rott and Carter dynamics went deeper than she ever imagined, and when she finally revealed herself, the reckoning would begin. Naomi could still smell the lingering scent of the cleaning solution in Darren Vaughn's office as she rushed to finish her remaining tasks. The cycle had repeated 3 times, each time with him finding new, increasingly ridiculous flaws. By the time he finally dismissed her, it was well past midnight. She was exhausted, behind schedule, and furious. But she had also learned something valuable. Darren's behavior wasn't random, it was a pattern. He manufactured messes. He set traps, coffee cups balanced just enough to spill, paper clips scattered across freshly vacuumed carpets. He did just enough to make complaints seem legitimate, so no one ever questioned him. Naomi had seen manipulative executives before, but Darren was next level. Still, she wondered, would the company's policies actually hold him accountable? Or had Carter Dynamics become a place where abuse was ignored as long as results were delivered? There was only one way to find out. It was time to test human resources. The day after Ethan's public humiliation with the water bottle, Naomi made a decision. She had enough evidence of abuse from both Ethan and Darren. If Carter Dynamics truly valued dignity and respect as written in their corporate values, then reporting them should lead to action. She decided to take the official route. The head of HR, Linda Marshall, was known for presenting herself as a champion of workplace fairness. She was in her mid-40s, always dressed in smart business casual, with a warm smile that made people feel at ease. Every employee support poster featured her face, alongside an invitation, "Talk to me. Your voice matters." The rainbow sticker on her office door and the words "Safe Space" in friendly typography completed the image. But was it real, or was it just corporate theater? Naomi was about to find out. During her lunch break, she walked into HR and knocked on Linda's office door. "Come in." Linda's voice was warm, inviting. Naomi stepped inside, hesitating slightly to appear nervous. Linda smiled, gesturing toward the chair. "What can I do for you today?" Naomi sat, choosing her words carefully. "I don't think we've met before," Linda added. "Are you new to the cleaning staff?" Naomi nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Then she told her story. She described Ethan's public humiliation and the water bottle incident, Darren's repeated harassment, the way both men treated lower-level workers. She kept her tone factual, professional, unemotional. She reported it exactly how she would have advised an employee to report misconduct when she was an executive. When she finished, she waited. Linda leaned back in her chair, head tilted slightly as if in deep thought. She let out a long sigh, then reached across the desk and gently patted Naomi's hand. "First of all, I want to thank you for bringing this to my attention." Naomi immediately recognized the tone. It was the carefully measured cadence of corporate damage control, not genuine concern. Linda continued, "We take all reports of workplace incidents very seriously here at Carter Dynamics." Naomi waited for the but, and it came right on schedule. "That said, I think there may be some confusion about workplace relationships here." Naomi's stomach tightened. "You're just a cleaner," Linda added, her tone still gentle but dismissive. "And in a company like this, there's a certain hierarchy. You can't compare yourself to other employees." There it was. Beneath the corporate jargon, the message was clear. You don't count. Your dignity is not our concern. Naomi forced herself to remain calm. She had expected resistance, but hearing it spoken so plainly still hit hard. She stood to leave, keeping her face neutral. Linda offered one last piece of advice before she walked out the door. "Between us," she said in a lower voice, "Ethan can be demanding when it comes to cleanliness. He has high expectations, and his communication style can be a bit direct." A thinly veiled excuse. My advice? Focus on meeting those standards, rather than taking things personally. In corporate environments, a thick skin is an asset. Naomi smiled politely. "Thank you for your time." Then she turned and walked out. As she passed the safe space sign on Linda's door, she felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat. Safe space? Not for the people who cleaned the building. What Linda didn't know was that Naomi had recorded the entire conversation. She had verbal proof that HR dismissed reports of abuse. Evidence that low-level employees were told to know their place. A direct quote from HR advising victims to grow thick skin instead of taking action. That recording would later become a crucial piece of evidence, a smoking gun, proving how systematically the company failed its most vulnerable workers. But Naomi wasn't done yet. Because if Ethan represented blatant cruelty and Darren represented manipulative abuse, then Veronica Price would reveal the most shocking truth of all. And it was worse than anything Naomi had witnessed so far. If Ethan Caldwell represented blatant cruelty, and Darren Vaughn embodied manipulative abuse, then Victoria Langley was something else entirely. She was ruthless, untouchable, and feared. At 45, Victoria was the senior vice president of sales at Carter Dynamics. Her sales team shattered targets, her industry presentations packed conference halls, and her cutthroat negotiation tactics secured multi-million-dollar contracts. She knew her worth to the company. And more dangerously, she knew no one would dare challenge her. That was until Friday night in week 3 of Naomi's undercover mission. That was until Victoria Langley met Nancy the janitor. The main conference room on the 38th floor was on Naomi's cleaning schedule for 9 p.m. She had just arrived, mop in hand, when a sharp voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, where do you think you're going?" Naomi turned, surprised to be directly addressed. It wasn't common for executives to acknowledge cleaners, let alone confront them. She straightened. "I'm sorry for interrupting, ma'am. This room is scheduled for cleaning at 9 p.m. I can return later if you need more time." A reasonable response. A professional response. But Victoria Langley didn't operate within the rules of professionalism. Her heels clicked against the floor as she strode forward, a predatory gleam in her eyes. "How dare you disrupt my meeting?" she snapped, stepping closer. "Do I need to waste my valuable time explaining basic professional courtesy to someone who scrubs toilets for a living?" The words landed like a slap, but Naomi held her ground. She had survived Ethan's humiliation. She had endured Darren's endless manipulations. But this was different. There was something uniquely infuriating about being berated for simply following the assigned schedule. Something that struck deeper than the insults she had already endured. For the first time in weeks, Naomi felt the urge to push back. And this time, she did. "With all due respect, ma'am," Naomi said, her voice quiet but firm, "I am following the established protocol for this building. If there's a conflict with the cleaning schedule, the proper procedure is to notify facilities management so adjustments can be made." She met Victoria's gaze, unflinching. "I'm simply trying to do my job, just as you are doing yours." The conference room fell silent. The junior salespeople in the room, who had been pretending not to notice the exchange, froze in place, their expressions locked in stunned disbelief. A cleaner had just spoken back to Victoria Langley. Even Victoria herself seemed momentarily caught off guard. For a brief second, Naomi thought she saw a flicker of uncertainty in the woman's cold blue eyes. But it was gone in an instant. Instead, her face twisted in fury. Before Naomi could react, Victoria Langley's hand flew through the air, a sharp, vicious arc. The crack echoed through the silent room. Naomi's head snapped to the side, pain blooming across her cheek. The impact sent her stumbling backward against her cleaning cart. For a moment, the only sound was the shallow breathing of the people in the room. No one spoke, no one moved. The junior salespeople stared at their screens, their notes, their hands, anywhere but at the assault they had just witnessed. Because acknowledging it meant accepting the reality of what they had seen, and accepting it meant risking their own positions. So they did what they always did. They looked away. Naomi felt the sting of the slap, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the shock that froze her in place. She had sat in boardrooms. She had negotiated million-dollar deals. She had built her career in corporate America. But never, not once, had she experienced such blatant physical assault in a professional setting. And yet, here she was, the CEO's daughter, the heir to Carter Dynamics, being slapped like an animal by a woman who believed there would be no consequences. Naomi's instincts screamed at her to break character, to stand up, tear off her disguise, and end Victoria's career in an instant. She could do it. One sentence, "You just assaulted the future CEO of this company," and Victoria Langley would be finished. But something deeper, more strategic, more instinctual held her back. This was bigger than just one moment. If she revealed herself too soon, she would lose the chance to expose the entire system that allowed this to happen. So, in a move that surprised even herself, she lowered her gaze. She mumbled an apology, and she began cleaning the room. As if nothing had happened. The red mark on her cheek burned, but Naomi had never felt more clear-headed in her life. Because this wasn't just about Ethan's verbal abuse, Darren's manipulations, HR's failure to act. This was about a culture that had allowed power to go unchecked for far too long. And after weeks of watching, learning, and documenting, Naomi had finally reached her breaking point. Not because this moment was the worst she had endured, but because it was the final confirmation of something she could no longer ignore. Carter Dynamics was broken, and in just a few days, Naomi Carter was going to burn the corruption to the ground. Carter Dynamics, once a company built on dignity and respect, had become a place where employees could be humiliated, degraded, and even physically assaulted without consequence. As Naomi wiped down the conference table, listening to the sales team laugh and chat as if nothing had happened, her mission shifted. She was no longer here to observe. She was here to collect evidence. Every interaction, every abuse, every failure of leadership would be recorded. She would document names, dates, incidents. And when her 2 weeks were over, the reckoning would begin. By the end of her second week undercover, Naomi had seen enough mistreatment to justify ending the experiment and exposing the truth. She had endured verbal abuse from Ethan Caldwell, manipulative power games from Darren Vaughn, blatant physical assault from Victoria Langley. And beyond them, she saw something even more sinister. It was bigger than bad leadership. This was corruption, and she needed proof. So Naomi adapted. She built a secure system to collect undeniable evidence. Her cleaning cart became the perfect cover. A miniature camera, small enough to hide among the cleaning supplies. A digital voice recorder tucked beneath the bottles and rags. Her phone on silent, ready to capture still images when necessary. She positioned herself strategically, using her invisibility to her advantage. She recorded conversations in meeting rooms. She photographed confidential documents carelessly left on desks. She captured after-hours interactions that revealed the company's true culture. And soon, she had everything she needed. The more Naomi uncovered, the darker the truth became. Ethan, Darren, and Victoria weren't just terrible leaders. They were criminals. The evidence exposed secret fund diversions, money meant for lower-level workers funneled into their own pockets. Leaked company information, deliberately sent to competitors to weaken Carter Dynamics from within. A silent coup, designed to push Samuel Carter out before the succession plan took effect. The betrayal ran deep. And now, Naomi had all the proof she needed to bring them down. As the end of her undercover period approached, Naomi faced a critical choice. Simply presenting the evidence to her father would expose the immediate conspiracy, remove the worst offenders. But would it solve the deeper cultural issues that had allowed this corruption to fester? If she went public, she risked damaging the company's reputation, harming innocent employees who had nothing to do with the corruption. This wasn't just about justice. It was about how to rebuild the company after the fall. And that required perfect timing, strategic thinking, and the courage to confront the people who had humiliated and abused her for weeks. Naomi had the evidence. Now she needed a plan. On Friday evening, Naomi finished her shift as usual. But this time, she took extra precautions. She made sure no one was following her before she slipped into a public restroom several blocks from Carter Dynamics headquarters. The transformation was drastic. She removed the headscarf, letting her natural curls fall freely. She replaced the plain glasses with her designer frames. She enhanced her features with subtle makeup, reclaiming the polished appearance she had deliberately downplayed. When she looked in the mirror, Nancy, the cleaner, was gone. Naomi Carter had returned. She stepped outside and called for a ride. As the car weaved through the city streets, she looked out the window at the towering glass building where she had been scrubbing floors just hours ago. The physical distance between these two worlds was only a few miles. But the psychological distance? It felt immeasurable. Samuel Carter was waiting for her at his home in Hillcrest, a sleek, modern mansion perched above the city skyline. From his office window, he could see the headquarters of Carter Dynamics, the empire he had built from nothing. And tonight, his daughter had returned from the trenches with a story he was not ready to hear. His expression was grave as she stepped inside. Naomi took a deep breath. Then she spoke the words that would change everything. "Dad, we have a problem, and I know exactly how to fix it." Samuel Carter studied his daughter's face. "You look exhausted," he said, his voice filled with paternal concern. Naomi exhaled slowly. "I am, she admitted, but not just physically. I'm emotionally drained by what I've uncovered. For the next 3 hours, she methodically laid out her findings. She displayed emails exposing financial fraud, performance reviews altered to punish innocent employees, leaked company data sent to competitors, video footage of abuse, of employees being humiliated, threatened, and assaulted. When she played the clip of Victoria Langley slapping her, Samuel's fist clenched involuntarily. When she showed the footage of Ethan Caldwell pouring water on her, his jaw tightened with barely controlled anger. By the time Naomi finished, Samuel sat in tense silence, his gaze dark and unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "They've betrayed everything this company stands for," he said, his voice low but vibrating with intensity. "Everything I built, everything I believed in." Naomi nodded. She knew this wasn't just about her. This was about the integrity of the empire her father had built from nothing. The question wasn't whether they would act. The question was how to do it in a way that created real, lasting change. Together, father and daughter devised a strategy. Step 1. Samuel would call an emergency board meeting for Monday morning. Step 2. All department heads and senior management would be required to attend. Step 3. The board would be briefed in advance, but only on the general nature of the issue. No specifics, no mention of Naomi's undercover work, no hint of the evidence they had. The goal? To capture their genuine reactions when the truth was revealed. And most importantly, Naomi would remain in disguise until the final moment. It would mean one last night of humiliation, one final shift as Nancy, the invisible janitor. But it would be worth it for the justice that was about to follow. Their planning went late into the night, refining every detail. Before she left, Samuel pulled Naomi into a tight embrace. "I thought this experience would teach you about leadership," he murmured. Then, with a small smile, he added, "But it seems you're the one teaching me." Naomi felt a lump rise in her throat. Whatever happened on Monday morning, one thing was certain. She wasn't just Samuel Carter's daughter anymore. She was the future of Carter Dynamics. By Sunday night, everything was in place. The board had been notified, the evidence was secured, security personnel had been quietly briefed. All that remained was the confrontation itself. Monday morning dawned clear and bright, the sunlight gleaming off the glass and steel of Carter Dynamics headquarters. At 8:30 a.m., executives poured into the building, unaware that their world was about to change forever. And among them, pushing a cleaning cart, walked Naomi Carter. Still in disguise, still playing the role of Nancy the janitor. For the last time, she had deliberately scheduled herself for one final task, to clean the executive boardroom before the 10 a.m. emergency meeting. She arrived early, rolling her cart into the impressive space. A massive oval table of polished walnut sat at the center, surrounded by leather chairs. This was where decisions that shaped the company were made. And today, the most important decision of all would happen right here. She had just begun dusting when the door swung open. Ethan Caldwell stepped inside. His expression soured the moment he saw her. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, briefcase in one hand, coffee in the other. Naomi kept her voice neutral. "I'm assigned to clean it, sir. I'll be finished before the meeting." Ethan's eyes narrowed, sweeping across the room. "Make sure it's actually clean this time," he snapped. "The CEO and board members will be here. If I find a single speck of dust," he leaned forward, lowering his voice, "you'll be fired." Naomi nodded calmly, suppressing the smirk that threatened to break across her face. In less than an hour, Ethan Caldwell was going to learn the true definition of being fired. And this time, it would be permanent. The air outside the boardroom was thick with confusion and tension. Executives and board members milled about, their expressions shifting between concern and curiosity at the unexpected emergency meeting. Samuel Carter arrived last, acknowledging greetings with brief nods but offering no explanation. His eyes flicked toward Naomi, who was still mopping near the door, just another invisible worker in a sea of power players. For the briefest moment, their gazes met. A silent understanding passed between father and daughter. Then he turned away, maintaining the illusion until the final moment. Naomi took a steady breath. It was almost time. At 9:55 a.m., Ethan Caldwell re-entered the boardroom. He immediately honed in on Naomi, playing his usual game of humiliation. You missed spots on the windows, he announced, running his finger along the flawless glass. And the table hasn't been properly polished. This is exactly the kind of sloppy work I've come to expect from new people. Naomi bit back a smirk as she responded in her practiced deferential tone. I'll take care of it right away, sir. She moved toward the table, pretending to clean areas that needed no attention. Inside, she counted the seconds. 5 more minutes. And then, the reckoning. At exactly 10 a.m., Samuel Carter's voice cut through the murmurs. Let's begin. The room fell silent. Naomi continued moving quietly in the background, dusting the shelves, circling the perimeter, seemingly invisible. But she missed nothing. Samuel's voice was grim. I've called this emergency meeting to address serious concerns about the corporate culture at Carter Dynamics. An uneasy shift went through the room. Linda Marshall from HR straightened in her chair, pen poised as if preparing to document solutions to a problem she had helped create. Darren Vaughn kept his cool, polished demeanor, though his fingers drummed nervously against the table. Victoria Langley sat still, her expression carefully neutral. But the tension in the room was undeniable. And then, Ethan snapped. Get her out, he barked, gesturing toward Naomi. This is sensitive corporate business. We don't need a cleaning lady in here. The moment had arrived. Every eye in the room turned toward the unassuming woman in the gray uniform, expecting her to scurry away like she always did. Instead, Naomi did something none of them expected. She set down the mop, straightened to her full height, and turned to face the room, not as Nancy the janitor, but as Naomi Carter. With an aura of quiet authority, she locked eyes with Ethan Caldwell. Then, in a calm, unshaken voice, she said, Actually, I'd like to stay, Ethan. A stunned silence filled the boardroom. The casual, first-name address hit Ethan like a slap. But before he could react, Naomi continued. In fact, I think you're the one who doesn't understand the situation. With deliberate movements, she removed the headscarf covering her curls. Then, she took off the plain glasses and replaced them with her signature designer frames. Finally, she unzipped the gray janitor's uniform, revealing a perfectly tailored blazer and blouse underneath. The transformation was electric. Shock rippled across the table like a wave. Mouths fell open. Recognition dawned like a slow, creeping horror. They had all worked with Naomi Carter for years, attended meetings with her, reported to her, strategized with her. And yet, for the past 2 weeks, not a single one of them had recognized her, because they had never truly seen the cleaning staff. To them, she had been invisible, until now. Naomi stepped forward, her presence commanding the room. My name is Naomi Carter. Her voice was calm but unyielding, and I am the next CEO of Carter Dynamics. Silence, pure, staggering silence. The weight of her words hung in the air, suffocating the guilty. She pulled a small remote from her pocket and tapped it. The presentation screen behind her flickered to life, and then the evidence began to play. Footage of Ethan dumping water on her, Darren forcing unnecessary recleanings, Victoria Langley slapping her, HR dismissing her complaint, telling her to grow thick skin. One by one, the monsters of Carter Dynamics watched themselves, exposed, documented, condemned. For the first time, they were the ones who felt powerless. Naomi turned back to face them. For the past 2 weeks, I've worked undercover as a member of the cleaning staff, she said, her voice steady. What I witnessed was not just bad management, it was corruption, cruelty, and a complete betrayal of everything this company claims to stand for. She let the words sink in. Then, with measured finality, she said, and today, it ends. The screen flickered, casting a cold glow across the stunned faces in the boardroom. The first clip played, Ethan Caldwell, standing over Naomi, dumping water onto her as she flinched, soaking wet, humiliated. The security camera angle was undeniable. His face was clear. The timestamp and location were visible. There was no escape. Ethan's arrogant demeanor crumbled as the truth stared back at him. His mouth opened and closed, scrambling for an excuse. That's taken out of context. She was insubordinate, and Naomi cut him off coldly. There is no context that makes that acceptable. A second clip played. Darren Vaughn, forcing her to reclean surfaces over and over again, using his position to exert petty dominance. Darren Vaughn, marketing director, has consistently wasted employee time through deliberate manipulation, Naomi stated. Darren tried to interject. I'm not finished, Naomi said, advancing to the next slide without even looking at him. More footage played, more evidence mounted. The weight of indisputable proof bore down on them. Some board members began furiously taking notes. Others sat frozen in disbelief, the sheer scale of corruption sinking in. One elderly board member removed his glasses, polished them slowly, then shook his head, as if hoping the next clip might change what he had just seen. It didn't. And then Victoria Langley made her final mistake. Victoria's sales instincts kicked in. She leaned forward, desperate to control the narrative. "This is a gross mischaracterization," she argued, her voice regaining a trace of confidence. "That video has clearly been edited." Naomi cut her off without hesitation, advancing to the next clip. A different camera angle. The exact same incident, this time capturing the reactions of the shocked junior employees who had witnessed it. Victoria Langley, in full clarity, slapping Naomi across the face. The sound of the crack echoed in the silent boardroom. The camera caught it all, her twisted expression of rage, the way Naomi stumbled back. The frozen faces of the sales team, too afraid to intervene. Naomi turned to her. "Would you like me to play the audio as well, Miss Langley?" Victoria's face went pale. The boardroom held its breath, and for the first time in her career of dominance, Victoria Langley had nothing to say. By the time Naomi concluded, the entire atmosphere of the boardroom had shifted. Gone was the entitlement, the arrogance, the casual cruelty. What remained was a room full of people realizing their power was slipping away. And Ethan Caldwell saw it first. His career, his reputation, his legacy, gone in the span of minutes. He turned toward Samuel Carter, his voice wavering. "I thought you were just a janitor," he muttered, his voice small, broken. Then, in a pathetic, desperate plea, he whispered, "Please, don't let me lose my job." The door behind him swung open. Two security officers stepped inside, standing at attention. One of them spoke, voice firm. "Mr. Caldwell, we've been instructed to ensure you leave the premises after this meeting." Ethan whipped around, his expression a mix of disbelief and fury. "You can't be serious." Samuel stood. For the first time since Naomi had begun her presentation, her father spoke directly to the room. "What we've witnessed today isn't just about individual misconduct," he said, his voice steady, "though that alone would warrant immediate termination." His gaze swept across the room, making direct eye contact with every executive still sitting there. "This is about a fundamental betrayal of everything Carter Dynamics was built on." He stepped forward, standing beside his daughter, a physical display of solidarity. "Naomi undertook this investigation at my request," he announced, "as part of our succession planning process." Gasps rippled through the room. It hadn't just been Naomi's idea. This had been sanctioned by the CEO himself. Samuel turned to the board, his voice heavy with conviction. "I built this company on integrity, innovation, and respect. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of those values." He let the silence stretch, letting the weight of those words settle. Then, with finality, "Today, we begin the process of reclaiming them." The next hour was dedicated to immediate action. The board voted unanimously to terminate Ethan Caldwell, Linda Marshall, Darren Vaughn, Victoria Langley, effective immediately. Security officers escorted them out one by one. Victoria kept her head high, trying to maintain her shattered dignity. Darren refused to make eye contact with anyone as he gathered his belongings. Linda said nothing, simply nodding before walking away. "And Ethan?" Ethan turned one last time toward Samuel. 30 years, Samuel," he said, his voice breaking. "I've given this company 30 years. You can't just throw that away based on a few incidents taken out of context." Samuel didn't hesitate. "You're right, Ethan." Ethan's face lit up with hope. But then Samuel finished his sentence. 30 years is a long time, which makes it even more disappointing that you spent them abusing your power instead of using it to lead. Ethan's face fell. He had lost, and he knew it. Security escorted him out the boardroom doors, and with him, a rotten chapter in Carter Dynamics came to an end. Ethan Caldwell was gone. Victoria Langley was gone. Darren Vaughn was gone. Linda Marshall was gone. Justice had been served. But as Naomi Carter watched the last of them disappear through the boardroom doors, she felt something unexpected. Not just satisfaction, not just relief, but the deep, humbling weight of what came next. Because this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. As the meeting continued, the board shifted its focus to next steps. How did this culture take root? How do they ensure it never happens again? What systems need to change? Some board members approached Naomi afterward, offering congratulations on her investigation. Others expressed shock and apologies for what she had endured. She accepted their words graciously, but with the calm, strategic focus that had allowed her to survive weeks of humiliation. This experience had changed her. And that was a good thing. When the room finally emptied, leaving only Naomi and her father, Samuel turned to her, pride evident in every fiber of his being. "You've done something remarkable here," he said softly. "Not just exposing corruption, but experiencing firsthand what needs to change." He shook his head. "I couldn't have done it. My pride wouldn't have allowed me to endure what you did." For the first time, Naomi felt tears rise in her eyes. Not from the memory of what she had suffered, but from the realization of how much she had grown. Samuel nodded. "The board wants to accelerate the succession timeline." He paused, looking at her carefully. "After today's presentation, they're convinced you're ready." Naomi turned to the window, staring at the city skyline. The weight of what she was about to inherit settled on her shoulders. For the first time, she truly understood what leadership meant. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about strategy. It was about people. And after everything she had been through, she knew. "I am ready." She turned back to her father, her voice steady. "But not because I'm your daughter. Not because I have the right degrees." She reached for the gray cleaning uniform she had discarded earlier, folding it with care. "I'm ready because I've seen this company from the bottom up." She looked down at the uniform in her hands, her voice quiet but resolute. "This taught me more about leadership than Harvard ever could. And I won't forget those lessons when I'm sitting at the head of this table." Samuel smiled. "Then it's yours." The road ahead wasn't easy. Change never is. Carter dynamics had been deeply flawed, and fixing it wasn't an overnight process. Some fought back. Those who had benefited from the old system resisted change. Some left. Not everyone was willing to adapt. Some thrived. People who had never been heard before found their voices, and slowly, measurably, things began to shift. 6 months later, employee satisfaction had risen significantly. Productivity had improved. Turnover had dropped, especially among workers who had been overlooked before. The company wasn't just recovering. It was becoming something better than it had ever been. But the biggest transformation wasn't just in the company. It was in Naomi herself. The physical work had changed her body, building strength and endurance she hadn't realized she needed. The emotional challenges had changed her heart, deepening her empathy and sharpening her understanding of power. The humiliation she had endured had remade her as a leader, and it showed in how she led. In meetings, she noticed who was interrupted and made sure they were heard. In decisions, she considered how changes affected everyone, not just executives. In daily interactions, she greeted maintenance staff by name, showing them the same respect as directors. Because she knew now, great companies aren't built just by those in power. They are built by every single person who keeps them running. 3 months later, Samuel Carter formally announced his retirement, and Naomi Carter officially stepped into the role of CEO. It was the beginning of a new chapter, for the company, for its people, and for her. Under her leadership, Carter Dynamics didn't just recover, it flourished. It became a place where employees felt valued. Ethics weren't just words, but actions. Leadership meant lifting others up, not stepping on them. And it all started because one woman was willing to go to the bottom, to learn what it truly meant to rise.